All right, so we are live. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this networked scholars Hangout air live. So today we are having Dr. Royce Kimmons with us, who is going to be sharing some of his thoughts on academics, challenges and tensions and conundrums faced when they're online. And it's my pleasure and privilege to have him join us. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction to Royce, he is the director of the Doceo Center for Innovation and Learning and an assistant professor of learning technologies at the University of Idaho. Royce studies technology integration, emergent technologies, and online learning, and I've had the pleasure to work with him for 3 or 4 years now. And I'm excited that he's joining us for this session. So before I jump into the questions that I've prepared for Royce, Royce, I want to turn it over to you and hear if there's anything that you'd like to share with us just as an introduction to this session.
Oh, thank you, George. I think you did a good job of introducing me, but I'm really interested in the experiences of educators, whether that's K-12 educators or higher education folks, and I think as we've done work together and as I've kind of explored, what really interests me in this sphere, I tend to always come back to what I think are the deeper questions of identity, questions of what are the implications of these things that we're doing and these behaviors that we're exhibiting online. So I'm hoping those are some of the things that we'll be talking about today. So what are some of the bigger issues associated with open scholarship and online participation?
Awesome, thank you, Royce. Yeah, those are definitely questions that we'll be tackling and discussing and exploring, and I'm hoping that those questions are also questions that individuals that are following along both in this session and in the MOOC are going to ask, of themselves as well, right? So, back in 2011, you and I wrote a paper discussing this idea of the network participatory scholarship, this practice that we saw of academics going online and sharing their work, engaging with others, discussing their work, critiquing, kind of trying to make sense of what it is that people do online. And we wrote about this quite a bit, but could you tell us a little bit more about what you think that, or why is this topic a topic that you feel is worthy of your time and of your research? As you're continuing to look into kind of emergent practices of academics online?
Yeah, so I guess to start, a big part of it was purely selfish. So at the time, I was a doctoral student. I was looking forward to when I would be, on the job market to get my first faculty position. And so I really had deep questions about, what should I be doing online? How should I be either networking with folks or presenting myself in a way that is professional? How should I be, communicating with people both in my field and outside of my field? How should I be using these media for outreach and those kinds of things? And so at the outset, part of it again was really selfish because I wanted to know from my own practice what should I be doing. But beyond that, though, I think I was really interested in, as we started to look at it, the historical issues that were arising and the idea that the university is coevolutionary with society, and that the university, the way that we understand it now and the work that we do at the university isn't a static phenomenon. It has evolved over time. It responds to social change. It responds to the technology of the time. And so scholars of today are very different from scholars 100 years ago. And if you go back further, they're even different still. And so thinking about, so what does that mean for you and for me as scholars? So if I'm entering into this field, if I'm expected to be a researcher, to be productive, and to be a meaningful participant in society, what does that mean for me today? But also, what does that mean for me 10 years from now or 20 years from now? If I'm going to be a meaningful contributor to the university, or to society, what does that mean, and what do I need to do that? So I guess I'm really interested in how both society is changing and how the university is changing, and how I, as an individual, can help to shape that. But then also how I, as an individual, need to respond to that, either to help prevent certain things from happening or to push for other things to happen.
Awesome, thank you, Royce. So, yeah, I'm gonna go off script for a little bit, but there's a lot of conversation about how um, universities have not changed forever. How, if you drop a teacher into a classroom nowadays, they'll know, they'll be comfortable and they'll know how to teach because we haven't seen change. But it sounds like that's not what you've been seeing in the work that you've been doing. Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so, well, in my current position, most of the work that I do is with K-12 teachers. So whether it's university students that we're preparing to become teachers, so training them to use technology so that they can be effective teachers once they enter the classroom, or it's with practicing teachers who maybe have new devices or want to seek after using new technologies in their classroom, and how do they use that effectively. And so obviously universities have to change, and I think that's a common response that you hear a lot. And the question of whether or not universities have changed is kind of interesting, because yes, they've changed, but I think that they have not necessarily changed as quickly as society has changed. And that's part of what I think the role that the university plays in society is. It helps to keep it moored in some ways. And so on the one hand, you hear people saying universities are, in the Stone Age, they're way behind the times, and that probably is true, but that doesn't mean that they haven't been changing. It's just that the rate at which they change might be a little bit slower, and I think purposefully slower than society at large. So universities have changed, they are changing, but I think the big question for us is, what are they changing into? And in our current society, we have lots of things pulling on the university to go in different directions, right? I think for-profit universities are a great example of that. That is a completely, in many ways, a very different mindset than what has traditionally been kind of the university model. And I think that's a great example of how kind of social expectations have led some institutions to shift in a direction that's new. So in terms of the teachers that we work with, I think it's really important for us to move away from kind of this ivory tower notion of a university. And it's one of the really exciting things that I find about open education when it comes to K-12, is that I'm really excited about the concept of not only taking the knowledge and resources that we have at the university and sharing them with K-12, but doing the opposite as well, allowing K-12 to influence what we're doing here at the university. So as we're using, for instance, open networks to communicate with teachers, that allows both me to share new information with them or exciting new research outcomes, but it also allows them to help me stay grounded in what is the reality of the classroom. So it makes the work that we do much more practical, makes the outreach that we do much more effective. So I think universities are changing. There's a great pull for them to change right now, from many different facets. But I think that I hope that we're changing in ways that ultimately are valuable, and that value educators as professionals, both K-12 educators and university faculty as professionals that exhibit professionalism in their practice.
Awesome, thank you, Royce. So as we're in this environment of kind of shifting paradigms, in this environment where universities are expected to change, they're changing. It's clear that our roles might change, our roles might shift as we're entering, into more conversations with K-12, as we're trying to improve our practice, rethink how we can better serve our students. So in this environment, it seems like there's a number of challenges and tensions that we might face, right? And those challenges and tensions frequently appear when we're online. And this is a topic that we've been discussing this week in the course. Could you tell us a little bit about what you think are the major challenges and tensions that academics might be facing nowadays when they're on social media or on online networks, or when they engage in kind of open practices on the web?
Yeah, so I think in large part, well, for me, probably the biggest challenge or tension isn't a new challenge, isn't something that cropped up as a result of the internet, but it's become, I guess, amplified as a result. So if you take K-12 teachers, for example, a K-12 teacher, if you go back 50 years, a K-12 teacher in a community was a well-respected member of the community. If you were a student in that person's class, you try to kind of looked at them as a professional and as someone that was worthy of respect and someone that in many ways did no wrong. And so one of the problems that has always existed with K-12 teachers is what happens then when a student sees a teacher outside of the school. So I remember when I was a student, if I saw one of my teachers at just a grocery store, that was just a mind-boggling experience. Like, oh, this person shops, this person has an actual life. And you've always had examples of K-12 teachers being punished for things that seem a bit ridiculous. So for instance, if you're in a community where, so say you're a student and you don't like your teacher, and this has happened before, so you follow your teacher and you watch where they go, and you notice that your teacher goes into a bar. You document that, and if you can use that as an argument that your teacher is acting in an unethical way because they go to a bar on their free time, and that kind of stuff has happened. But I think what the internet does is it allows those kinds of things to happen at a much faster pace and a much larger scale. So because of this kind of community of lateral surveillance that we've created, where everyone is watching everyone has the ability not only to see what other people are doing, but there's this expectation that I am sharing very openly the things that I'm doing. It forces us to come to grips with what should be that kind of line between personal and professional in the lives of educators. And I think that's especially poignant for K-12 teachers, but it applies to university faculty as well. So university faculty, they are held to certain standards of ethics. They are expected to act in certain ways. And I think in many ways we kind of assume that they don't have a personal life, they don't have a political opinion, they don't have a religious affiliation sometimes, or we assume that. And then when we have the internet, we have these social spaces where they begin to voice those things, it changes the dynamic of our relationship with them. So I think the biggest challenge or the biggest tension is a tension of and challenge of identity. What does it mean to be an educator? What does that mean for my personal life when I become an educator? What parts of my personal life do I give up? What parts of my personal life do I mute? Do I not let other people know about? And then what parts of my personal life do I celebrate and share with others? And then how are other people interpreting that? So I think it's a personal question in terms of what I do online, but it's also a social question in terms of how we are interpreting the behaviors of others and how we are either passing judgment on educators or I guess embracing them for their rich and diverse experiences.
So that's a really interesting observation, Royce. And the question that often comes up, at least in my mind, is how do we address that, right? Is it a matter of is it a curricular problem? Is it a problem in which we need to develop particular policies to prevent various behaviors? Is it a platform problem, right? Are the technologies that are available right now encouraging and shaping us to participate in certain ways that bring up these issues? How do we I suppose the question is, how do we think about this issue, and how do we help people come to grips with it and address it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so I think the three big pieces are the platforms that we're using. So what, as you said, what are they kind of eliciting out of us? Um, then our own behavior, and then policy. I don't know the answer to the policy question, and you know, I I think that's something that we just need to keep working through. And I don't feel like I'm in a place to address that. But I think that, well, first to talk about the platforms, yes, I think that certain platforms elicit certain types of behaviors. So if you look at the way that someone participates on Facebook, for instance, and the way they participate on Tumblr or Tinder, that's going to be very, very different between each one, right? Right? The reason being that each platform has certain assumptions of what is acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable behavior and what is expected behavior. So if I am a member of Facebook, then I am going to be encouraged by both the platform and the people that I connect with and the people that the platform intentionally tries to connect me with to participate in certain ways. And so in many cases, I think those types of platforms specifically try to elicit types of behaviors that could be viewed as problematic. Or even if you think about Twitter, think about the 140 character limit. If I'm trying to say anything meaningful in 140 characters, oftentimes that comes out as pithy or as small-minded or as reductionist. And so what does that do? Which means, say if I want to voice a political opinion on Twitter, if I'm limited to 140 characters, that means that I have to, in many ways, take a very reductionist approach to the politics that I share. And so I think these platforms force us in many ways to participate in certain ways or to frame our experience in certain ways that is problematic. And I don't know that that's necessarily a statement about certain platforms are better than others, but I think it means that as we participate in these platforms, we need to be aware of what that is. We need to be aware of what that platform is eliciting from us and how it's shaping or framing our participation in certain ways. And then obviously the other piece of that is, well, how do I frame my own experience in these platforms? So how do I personally draw lines between professional and personal, or I say that without necessarily implying that identity is framed in that way, but I think identity is much more complex than just I have a personal side and a professional side. I think there's much, much more to it than that. But I think that we have these platforms that rely on authentic identity. They rely on this narrative that I have one singular monolithic identity that is connected to my name, and I have to be sharing that, and that should be the same in all of these places. I really miss the more anonymous days of the internet when it wasn't expected that you would use your real name when you were participating in an online forum, for instance. What is it about? Why do we assume that in order to meaningfully participate, in order to express your identity, you have to connect that to your real name or to your real picture? Why do we think that identity is monolithic in that way? Why do we think that that's how identity is framed? And so I think that for scholars, it really behooves us to think about what is identity? What is identity for me, and how does that shape what platforms I participate in and how I participate in each of them?
Royce, these comments are great, and they relate a lot to your dissertation and the work that you did there. So I want to connect it to a little bit and ask you to expand just a tad on the work that you've done with pre-service teachers in your dissertation, and maybe tell us a little bit more about the notion of authentic identity and how you saw that being expressed in social network spaces.
Yeah, sure. So I think identity, again, is very interesting and very complicated. And whenever I think before we start thinking about identity, we kind of assume that we know what it is. But then as we contemplate it more, it becomes more problematic. Um, I think that most people, well, when I was doing my dissertation, I worked with pre-service teachers. So these were students in a college of education that were preparing to become teachers, and I picked the young group of pre-service teachers to work with. So I picked those who were just starting the pre-service teacher program. So they had been college students for a year or two, but now they were just starting to start their coursework to become teachers. So before then, they were doing general ed and those kinds of things. So they had the time to um, uh, enter the culture of college, but then I got them right when they had already become acclimatized to that culture, but now were being expected to start acting like teachers. And what I studied was how they understood their own identities and how that translated into their behavior in these online spaces. Much of my dissertation is framed by the time um, uh, Facebook was and still is the dominant social media platform that they use. So much of it surrounds Facebook, but Twitter is part of it, Tumblr is part of it, and MySpace is part of it because the age group I was working with grew up using MySpace, made the shift to Facebook in high school, and then stayed with Facebook to the point where I got them. And some of the things that I found about identity that I thought were interesting was that um, students had bought into this narrative that Facebook had fed them or it had expected of them that identity is monolithic and that as I am participating online, I'm expressing my real identity. And not only that, but other people are expressing theirs, which means that I can make judgments about them based upon what they're doing or not doing online. So if someone says something potentially aggressive or um, offensive, that means they're an offensive person. If I say something, it might be taken out of context, but that doesn't mean I'm offensive. So as we would talk through these kinds of issues, it was really interesting for me to see how they changed as a result. And how they came to view professionalism. And it was fascinating to me because I didn't come into this trying to tell them what they should or should not be doing online. Some of them actually asked me, what should I be doing? And I just say, I don't know. That's why I'm studying this. But they really wanted to know what they needed to do to be professional. And it was fascinating to me that the way that they ended up interpreting it in the long run was being professional on Facebook means not posting anything. And I thought that's just so bizarre that they interpreted becoming a professional as essentially becoming silent, as essentially not sharing any piece of yourself with the world around you, not being a contributor to your community, not participating socially. And their main reason for that was fear of being misinterpreted, fear of their participation being misinterpreted. Um, and the two areas where that really came up, really in a pronounced way, had to do with religion and politics. And it was fascinating. Almost in every single case, they decided through the course of this short semester-long project where they were being introduced to professionalism that they would no longer post anything political online or post anything religious for the most part. But for many of them, that was potentially a big struggle. Part of this is framed where the dissertation was located. So this was in Austin. This was in Texas. And so many of the students that we worked with came from religious conservative families. And it was fascinating to me. One of the interesting things was, though their politics were important to them and their religion was important to them, religion trumped their politics. And so in all cases, they felt like they needed to not share those things online, but they didn't feel so bad about not being able to share their politics. They thought, well, that's kind of a legitimate concern. That's kind of a legitimate sacrifice that I should be making for my students in order to become a professional. But in the case of religion, they said that's not acceptable. And so either I am going to just leave the space entirely because I can no longer voice who I am and share who I am, or maybe this isn't the path that I should be following at all. And so I think it brought up for me a lot of issues about identity and what it is about us. What are our core values that lead us to shape or to express our identity in certain ways? And when we feel like we cannot share those through these social media, then it leads to a situation where we ask, well, what's the point? If I can't express my identity, then why am I even using this? And so then you just shut down and you don't use it anymore.
Sure. So this is, it's really fascinating to me how it becomes clear here how our online participation is shaped by the sociocultural environment that we're finding ourselves in, right? In the same way that you mentioned your findings being shaped by the geographical location in which the dissertation happened, in the same way that you're describing individuals' expression of identity being tied to one particular facet of who they are. I think those are all significant issues that we need to come to terms with when we're trying to understand how it is that we use these technologies and how the environment that we're finding ourselves in is shaping our use of those technologies and thereby our experiences. Royce, I'm just going to take a pause here and take Nick's question posted on the Q&A, and just essentially to also mention to everyone following along to please feel free to pass along your questions. But this question takes us back to something that you said before. Essentially, Nick is asking, are we not, as educators, are we not part of the community in which we're existing, right? So when you're talking about students seeing a teacher out shopping or going at the bar, is part of the surprise there the result of educators not being as close to their community? So are we creating this by setting ourselves apart? Any thoughts that you have about that question?
Yeah, well, I think it gets to the heart of what role should the educator play in the community, right? And the way that most schools, at least in the United States, operate is in their teacher contracts, they have something called the moral turpitude clause, which basically says that we have all these guidelines, all these things that you should be following, but basically it comes down to our discretion to determine whether you're acting morally or immorally. And I think this really comes to a head in those cases because if you live in a community that has certain common values, then this really doesn't come up. But as soon as someone who comes into that community who may not share all of those values or who may not be aware of even what those values are, if those are not explicitly stated, then educators can feel like they're being judged for things that are unfair, that are unstated, and that are contrary to how they perceive themselves and contrary to their identity. And what that leads to then is, if I as an educator am being judged by what other people might find to be offensive, and I don't know, I can't anticipate what they might find to be offensive, then the safe route is just not to do anything, not to express anything, and just to be silent about it.
Thank you, Royce. And I have a follow-up question from Francis, which I think relates to this idea of being silent online. But Francis essentially asks, this shutdown that we're describing, right? The idea that individuals are choosing to stop participating or deciding that the best way forward would be to stop participating. Does this relate to a recent report that was put out by the Pew Internet group, where essentially they found that individuals were choosing not to have conversations about the Edward Snowden case online, and they were choosing to instead not talk about that, when in theory these technologies are supposed to bring us closer together and encourage conversation, interaction, especially in cases where we might disagree.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts or comments about this one?
Well, I'm not really familiar with this report. It looks interesting. I'll go back and look into it some more. But I think one of the things that this brings up, or one of the items that are of interest, is that so say you're teaching a class and you create a forum in your class to talk about Edward Snowden. That space as a discussion forum is very, very different from, say, your Facebook feed. And well, why is it different? One major way, and maybe the main way that it's different, is that your Facebook feed connects you with people from various aspects of your life that probably have very different opinions from you, very different life experiences. And so, some of the work that we've done where we have interviewed faculty and teachers is, faculty will say, so I have these ultra conservative friends on Facebook and I have these ultra liberal friends. And it puts us in a place where we feel like if we say anything, it can be interpreted one way or the other as being wrong or being insensitive or being whatever, and can open us up to attack from one or the other side. And it's not that all these issues are on a single spectrum. It's just one side or the other, but it's all around, right? There's so many diverse perspectives on any of these things that we have this kind of open forum in Facebook and other social media that we're connected with so many diverse people that if we say anything, it can easily be taken out of context and open us up for attack. And I think the interesting thing also about these spaces is that, say I have a friend that posts something about Edward Snowden, and I think he's probably mostly right, but there's just a couple points here that I think that I need to push his thinking on a little bit. So if I say, maybe on his Facebook feed, if I just respond to him and say, I think you're probably right on most of these points, but I think you probably should think about this piece a little bit more. Well, one of the things that Facebook does is that is now not only a conversation between me and him, but I have called him out in front of his entire network, basically. Or it could be perceived that way. And not only that, but it is part of his profile, it's part of his identity. Someone who goes to his Facebook feed, they see his name and then they see this comment right here. So he has to respond to it in order to maintain his control of his space, right? And in order to potentially save face in front of his entire network. And so I think that it just naturally leads to these problematic situations where either we just go nuts and attack one another back and forth, or we just don't say anything because we're afraid of being attacked.
That's a great comment, Royce. And I remember us having this conversation on a drive from Virginia to a conference. And I think the conclusion that we came at that point was that we should just stop calling people out on things and just say, yes, you are right. Everything that you have said here is absolutely correct.
So maybe it's a spiral of acquiescence.
There you go. I'm going to, so thanks for those questions. Please feel free to keep passing some thoughts here for us. But Royce, I'm going to jump from these conversations that have focused a lot on identity and the platforms that we're engaging with to openness. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to take the next question that came in because it's related. But Julie is asking, if educators choose not to participate, how might this prevent them from having informed conversations with their students about online behavior? Teachers who do not understand Twitter cannot understand why kids use it and might dismiss it as irrelevant. So essentially, do we need to be there to understand these platforms?
Well, I think part of being a good educator is understanding the culture of the time and understanding the culture that your kids are operating in. So I think that applies to these technologies for sure, just as it applies to any social norm. You should be aware of it, and and be able to at least speak with the same language so that you can communicate with your kids in a way that they can understand. So I could definitely see if educators think that they can just ignore these types of trends and technologies, that they will create a rift between them and students. But I also think that we need to be thoughtful about how we think educators should be participating in these spaces. And so I'll give you an example. So, one of the first people that really started studying this area was Dana Boyd, and one of one of her first articles was about about scholars becoming micro celebrities and things like that. And I think is a really interesting article. And she's done a lot of great work in this area. But I wonder if we take those types of articles or those types of observations and begin to think that there is a particular way that all educators should be participating in these media. So do all educators need to become micro celebrities in online spaces in order to reach out to their students? I don't think so. But I'm afraid that some of the language that we use or some of the conversations that we have may lead to that kind of a conclusion. Um, so so yes, educators need to be aware of it. They need to think about how it connects in with their own practice. But I think that the ongoing conversation we need to have is, what constitutes meaningful participation in these spaces, and is there one way that educators need to be participating in these spaces, or are there multiple different ways that they could be participating? And I think there's a comparison that could be made to like an online forum or to MOOCs and people who participate in MOOCs. There are different ways to legitimately participate in a MOOC. So there's conversations about lurkers and these others, but ultimately there are lots of ways to gain meaning out of these spaces, and we don't need to think that everyone needs to be a Dana Boyd in order to reach out to their students and to effectively use the space.
All right. Thank you, Royce. So we touched upon a lot of these challenges, right? We talked a lot about identity, trying to make sense of it, trying to make sense whether it's one unitary monolithic thing. We talked about the platforms kind of shaping the ways that we are, our interactions with others, and a lot of our conversation has touched on the tensions individuals might encounter when they participate, when they're encouraged to participate online. And a lot of these ideas connect to openness. And I wanted to just shift the conversation a little bit and essentially ask you, why do you think openness might be desirable, or I suppose I should take a step back and say, is openness desirable from where you stand? And if so, do you have any positive experiences or stories with openness that you could share with us today?
Yeah, so I think there are obviously some really great benefits to openness. So I think for me, the greatest benefits are fostering transparency, fostering this, tearing down a lot of these traditional walls that we have allowed to enter into our relationships with one another. I think it's a sad statement of our society that you can gauge the importance of a person based upon the number of doors between them and the outside world. The more important you get, the further back in the institution they place you. And I think that as faculty, becoming an open educator is very important to allow for that kind of transparency, so that for me, a K-12 teacher can even talk to me or feel like that they have a place to talk to me. Whereas I think that if I didn't, go down some of these routes with openness, they wouldn't feel like that was even possible. So I think transparency is a huge piece of it. But then I also think that flexibility is a huge piece, in that in order to be an effective educator and an effective researcher, I rely on open tools all the time. I rely on open content. I rely on open source software. And so what then am I contributing back? So as I'm using these resources, am I adding to the resource pool that exists so that other people can gain benefit from that as well. So I think the openness of these resources makes them flexible to our needs, and then also empowers us to do more. So I think openness is definitely valuable, and I think that I gauge much of my own. I think in my quiet time when I try to figure out am I really doing what I should be doing as an educator, as a faculty member. I think a lot of the kind of values and core issues that I go back to in order to self-evaluate revolve around issues of openness and these issues of equity and access and sharing. Um, and obviously the tension there is, does the university value those same things, which I know is probably something you've already talked about quite a bit. Um, but yeah, I think in our personal experiences as educators, openness should be central to the work that we do. And I think David Wiley talks about this beautifully in his work. Just that ultimately the heart of a teacher, the heart of any educator, is that they want to share. And so all that openness does is help us to share with more people more effectively.
Awesome. Thank you, Royce. So I like this, the idea that you're sharing in that, in you going back and thinking about whether what you are doing, makes the contribution that you want to make to the world. And as as individuals that function within their systems, I'm curious as to what you think we need to do, either as individuals or as universities, what we need to do to support and encourage openness and network practice. Assuming that the two go together. So, is there something that we can do as faculty, as researchers? Is there something that the institution can do to encourage some of these ideas and some of these values?
Yeah, so this is a struggle, and it's a struggle that honestly, when I started as a faculty member here about a year and a half ago, I didn't expect to face. And it's not because of this institution or anything, but I think just that openness itself isn't a very shiny or exciting catchphrase or catchword or topic. When you start talking to a dean or department chair about open practice and openness and doing an open course, it's not something that they get excited about, and it's mainly because they just don't understand what it is or what that means. And I think that openness, one of the problems with it, and open education, one of the problems with it is that it's the terminology we use is deceptive, in that people, when they hear open education, even if they've never heard the phrase before, they think, oh yeah, I understand what that means, and they don't. And actually, we did a study on this with K-12 teachers. We brought them in for a 3-day Open Education Institute. We did pre and post tests on it to see how they how they self-assessed on issues of open education, on copyright, on fair use, and these things. And what we found was, actually what we were expecting was that they self-evaluated way higher than they really actually were at the beginning. But then by the end, when they actually had gone through the institute and understood now what these different things meant, then they realized, oh yeah, I really had no idea what I was talking about back then. But so I think that a big part of what we need to do is to help people understand just even what these terms mean. And I think that it's a hard sell sometimes just because of that. And if it's not connected to requirements for tenure and promotion, oftentimes it's hard to do as well, just because everyone's strapped for time. And in order to be an open educator and to share something back to the community, that takes more time. It's one thing just to take my lecture PowerPoint and post that online, but if I'm going to do that in a way that other people can reuse and remix it, and really gain value from it, that takes a little bit more thought on my part, a little bit more effort. So I think that one the struggle that I think we all have to deal with is, if I believe in this, then how do I guess, make the small sacrifice necessary of time and effort to really try to be open, to really share things in a way that's useful for others. And I think like open source software is a really great example of this, because there are all kinds of open source software packages out there, but the really good ones, the ones that get a lot of traction, are the ones that have really strong communities around them that make it very clear, like explain how to use their resources, put up tutorials, do Q&A sessions, and those kinds of things. So it's one thing just to share something, just to put it out there, but it's something else entirely to support it in a way that makes it actually useful to other people. And so, that's a struggle that we have to have with ourselves, but then also with our leadership and trying to determine, how we're spending our time. But I hope. And a lot of the conversation around open education is ethical, right? And I think that ultimately it should be. That should be the basis of the conversation. But I would hope that there's practical value that comes out of it as well. I would hope that through this process we're making connections that are valuable to us. I would hope that by publishing in an open access journal, for instance, we're getting more traction and more people are seeing our work. I would hope that there are practical outcomes for a lot of these things. Whether or not there is, and I think there's some evidence to show that there are practical outcomes, but I think we just need to keep working through that and try to see, what are the ultimate outcomes of this effort, or all of these efforts.
Awesome. Royce, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing with us your thoughts and helping us think through some of these issues, spanning everything and anything between ethics and practical benefits and identity and who we are as scholars and as academics and educators, and what the role of openness is in today's universities. And the universities that you've said and we've talked about have been shifting and changing and facing tensions that are encouraging them to change. So I'm going to take one last question from Nick, who's just shared it there, and throw it at you, and then also give you an opportunity to share any final thoughts with us. But Nick is asking, using your open source software model, is there a similar community in the educator community for K-12 that could consider the design and development of open source models?
Yeah, I think there's some great resources out there that are starting down this road. So, when I work with K-12 teachers, I show them lots of different resources, lots of different sites and things. But really, one of the ones that they get the most excited about is CK12 when they see that, just because of all the work that's already gone into that, all the people that have already contributed to that project. But I think that lacks kind of what you're getting at here, Nick, in that larger community feel. Like this, even with CK12, it feels a lot more like this. These are products that educators have created, they put up, and I can take in and reuse them and maybe redistribute them, maybe repost them. But there's not a lot of the background conversation going on of how do we as a team make this a better product. And I don't know the answer to that. I think in K-12, the biggest problem is just teachers feel so stressed for time that they don't feel they can meaningfully contribute to these kinds of communities. But I mean, I think that definitely should be our goal. So one of the things that I'm trying to do in my work here is trying to build an online community with these folks. And I don't know necessarily how to do that. I don't necessarily know how you create a community that has value across so many diverse contexts and at the same time pulls in all of the expertise of so many K-12 educators. But I think one of the simple ways that we can do, gets back to this idea of kind of destroying the ivory tower and creating open lines of communication between K-12 and higher ed. So for instance, we started a Google Plus community after our Open Education Institute so that all the teachers that participate in those institutes could stay connected with us and ask us questions about open education. And that's an open community; anyone can join it. But has it been heavily utilized? Maybe not. It hasn't. And I think again, it really gets down to how do we kind of I don't know if we need to incentivize it for teachers or what, but Idaho in our state, teachers are very underpaid. They could go 8 miles away to Washington to make $10,000 more. They work really hard, and so they struggle to I think make ends meet, and so it's a struggle for them to even think about how do I contribute to this larger community. So I think that's an ongoing issue that we have with teachers, and I don't think it's insurmountable, but it's a real tension. And George and I talked about this yesterday as well, but I also think there's this fear among teachers of being exploited, having their efforts exploited in these kinds of spaces. And that leads to a little bit of fear for them to share their expertise. So if I'm underpaid, if I'm overworked, if I am a highly educated person, I might not be so excited to put my own intellectual property out on the internet for other people to use, especially if I'm afraid that a publisher might use my work or whatever, right? So those are some of the tensions that I hear from teachers when we talk about open education. Again, I don't think they're insurmountable, but I think it's something that we have to gradually work our way through and feel our way through.
All right. Thank you, Royce. Do you have any final comments before my closing comments? Do you have anything else to share with us?
No, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for having me. I feel like I talked a lot, but thanks for letting me chat.
No, you bet. Thank you so much again for taking the time. It's always a pleasure, Royce. And you can find Royce on Twitter for follow-up questions if you want. Royce Kimmons is his handle, and you can also check out his website, royce.kimmons.me. I'm encouraging him to get a .com domain name, but I don't think he's going to move towards that. But thank you, everyone, for spending this time with us. And I'll be posting this on YouTube and sharing it with the rest of you.